thank you each for your introductions. I have a question that I know has already been provided to you by the organisers tonight, by Lighter Footprints, and I'm going to put that question to each of you now, starting here with you, Nick. What year should Victoria end native forest logging, and why?
2023. It needs to be done now. Our forests are great for carbon storage. They help with stop water runoff. They're just wonderful, wonderful examples of biodiversity that we need to protect. There's the greater glider at risk, leadbeater possum, mountain ash, all these trees. We need each and every one of these to survive. We need a functioning ecosystem, and logging it, destroying it at a loss, by the way. We are not making money, and we can get every bit we need from timber plantations. It needs to end in 2023.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. Well, as John said earlier, the state government has made a policy announcement that all native timber harvesting is to end by 2030. I imagine it's going to end well before then. And I think John indicated that most of it will end probably in 2024. So I think one of the biggest priorities that exists is to support those communities through that transition. But I do want to make two quick points in addition to that. First of all, I do think we need to support a sustainable plantation-based timber industry. I mean, we want timber used in construction. And my concern is that if you look at what's happened in the last 2.5 years, the current state government hasn't supported that transition to plantation, and there was an announcement, as some of you may recall, of $110 million for plantation-based transitional support. That wasn't actually spent on any of that. And so the Minister Galtini made an announcement a little over a month ago that 120 would be invested in plantation-based transition. Now, I think if we're going to say we're going to support plantation timber, which is important for the environment because we want sustainable product in construction, then I would say to the state government, if you're making these commitments of 110 or now 120, you've got to actually follow through on it and actually spend that money to support those plantations.
Just I'll handle the questions, but thank you for your encouragement. To be clear, what timeline does your party support phasing out native forest logging?
Well, it's going to shut under the law by 2030.
So you support the timeline?
Well, I can't see how the industry is going to survive much beyond 2024, to be honest, with the law that's been put in place. So, okay. Look, we're transitioning out of native timber. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Communities, I think, increasingly are accepting that we have to transition out of that. It's part of the journey we've all been speaking about. So it's got to happen. My main concern is to make sure that those communities are supported because, look, I grew up in the Latrobe Valley and I have a sentimental attachment to a lot of those families who go through this. So sure, that we have to transition out of that, and I accept that. And under the current policy setting, that's going to happen very soon, probably in the next couple of years.
Sure. Thank you. Melissa?
I'm with Nick, actually. We need an immediate end to forest logging, to native forest logging. And need an immediate legislated end as well, not just at some time in the future of 2023. I've got 2024 down as my date in my policy. I'm meaning early 2024, very early 2024. I was in Talangi Forest recently, and it was pretty devastating, and I think that many of you have probably also been there as well. The forest is just not actually, it's not like logging, like we get, axes and we chop trees. No, we just get trucks and they come through and they just plough everything down. And what's left is actually devastating. Of the timber that's totally destroyed and of the land that's totally destroyed, only 60% of that finds its way onto a truck. And they're the big logs that you might see on log trucks. The rest of it's just left on the ground. Sometimes it's burnt, sometimes it's not. The timber is then taken off. 80% of the timber that is taken is used for pulp, for paper. There's only 10%, I think, that is only 10% that is used for any kind of timber industry at all. and the rest is just used for wood chipping. It's absolute disgrace. And these are the homes of our native animals, of our endangered species, of biodiversity. These forests keep our water clean. They stop things burning at incredibly incineration type rates. We need our native forests. We need to stop logging them. It costs us $21 million a year to log our forests. We have about 300 workers in that space. We can certainly support them transitioning to new jobs. Why are we spending $21 million of our money to log our native forests and destroy biodiversity? Those forests are worth 24% of carbon sequestration in this state. We need to stop.
And John, over to you.
So when should we end? Well, obviously as soon as practically possible. We have to bring the communities affected by this decision with us in regional Victoria. We need to have plantations ready to fill the supply, which will be the case by 2030. It's not the case now. Our government believes we can end it in 2030 with major reductions in 2024. We are providing over $200 million to help logging workers, businesses and communities in transition, or to transition. Importing timber from other countries without rigorous standards to meet the shortfall hardly helps the planet.
There is a second question. Sorry, there is a second question from the organisers. Do you support new fossil fuel projects in Victoria and why? And Melissa, I'm going to start with you.
No, no I don't. The best form of fuel that we can use in Australia is free. It's solar, it's wind. We have an abundant opportunity to pick up solar and wind. We do not need, nor should we be using any fossil fuels. We do not need to be digging more holes in the ground. We do not need to be fracking. These things are dangerous to our environment, and as we've heard, we need immediate action on climate. We should not be using burning fossil fuels anymore.
Thank you. John Kennedy.
I don't have an opinion on that. I want to see what's
Your
involved.
party does.
I'm sorry?
Your party does.
Yes, yes.
Anything further? No? Okay. John
Look,
Cassidy.
of course we want to transition, ladies and gentlemen, we really do, but we've got to take the community with us, and if we were to shut everything, I don't think anyone seriously is saying we can shut things today. We all want to get there, and we've got to understand that there are communities we've got to bring with us. There's a network, an infrastructure network to effect the transition of this new energy, this new grid that is going to take some time to build. So it's not as if, I'm certainly not out there, Victoria, saying, yay, we're moving out of that. We're moving out of it as fast as we can. But we've got to be methodical about it. Yes, be determined. Yes, not waste a moment. That cannot be justified, not going down that journey. But we've got to be methodical. And I think that's what the Victorian people, I think that's what the Australian people want. They want action, and I think, to be completely candid with you, that's the clear message to me that's come out of recent elections. They want action, right? They do. But they also want it to be done sensibly and methodically and to bring everybody with us. And I think that's the important thing we've got to do. And we do that, we get that bit right, we will get there.
To be clear, in both of these last two answers, they're encouraging answers on one level, but both of your parties support expansion of offshore gas, and John, your party supports expansion of onshore gas. Do either of you have a comment on those positions?
Yeah, look, I might address that, John. Look, we've been up front that as part of the transition, we may need to tap into gas. And I noticed Jim Chalmers even last week on Melbourne radio talking about trying to find new sources of supply to deal with, exorbitant gas prices that people are doing. We're not doing that because we want a long-term future. We get gas is not a permanent part of our energy mix. But we're trying to be reasonable and get our community through this period. Some of them are short-lived, some of the transitional obstacles and challenges we face, but it's not a permanent part. It is a part of the transition. So yeah, there is some of that, and we've been open about that. but it's in order to help us get there. Certainly coal is on the way out, and my expectation is that, probably by 2030 our coal fleet will be redundant. But that's just my prediction.
As Jono was saying earlier tonight, we want a transition that works for all of us, and that's what we need to be assured about in terms of action and fairness are the two themes for me tonight.
And on the one hand, your party has a gas substitution roadmap, and on the other hand is opening up for new gas exploration off the coast. Okay, thank you. Nick?
No, we definitely shouldn't. John is right about one thing, though, and I never thought I'd say that. It's just that we do need transition workers, and that's why the Greens are going to invest $10 billion into renewables. And when we end logging in 2023, we're going to make sure that these workers have paid for training to transition into land restoration, helping with recovery after fires and floods. Coal workers and loggers as well will of course be trained in maintaining and construction of these renewables we are going to build. We cannot afford any more oil and gas at all, so no.
Thank you, Nick. And let's run with this theme of training. I noticed when Jono was speaking, there was some really strong applause for the fact that there's actually going to need to be some massive retraining. If we're going to get the scale of change that is required in the timeframes that are required, this is new jobs, new training across the board in a whole range of ways. What policies will your party put forward to support training through TAFE, through the university system, through any other mechanisms to support that new workforce? And we'll continue with you if we can, Nick.
Well, the Greens have a good policy for making education genuinely free, which would just eliminate out-of-pocket costs. But in terms of specifically how we transition workers from these, we would create a subsidy. So anybody who wants to work, like not retrain and just work outside the sector, the Greens will offer to pay 50% of whoever employs them, their salary. So everyone can have a job should they not want to retrain. But in terms of training, everything is going to be paid for. If relocation is needed, relocation will happen.
Look, I think like other areas of manufacturing and generation, it needs to be industry-led. So the clean energy investors and generators and retailers, they need to lead it, because one of the biggest problems you'll find talking to industry leaders across manufacturing in Victoria and probably in other states as well is that they are complaining that they can't get the skills they need and that what's coming out of our institutes is not responsive to the needs. So in the Coalition, we're very concerned to make sure that we take the lessons from them and the leads as to what skill sets they need. So as these emerging technologies reach scale, that we've got the staff who have the proper skills. And at the moment, I'm not confident that that's coming through based on the feedback I get from talking to a lot of people in industry today. We've got a $2.5 billion manufacturing plan which can be scaled to cover transition across and training across a range of different industries, and clean technologies will be one of those.
I think that we do need to invest definitely in education, and this is a really big problem. We need to attract people to education, and we're not going to do that if we're going to charge them fees. We do need to get people trained. We also do need to encourage industry. We need long-term planning. We don't need 3-year planning, 2-month planning, 5-month planning. We need long-term investment to allow industry to see the opportunity to invest in what will be a green future, a green economy. If people see jobs in that place, then people will train in that space as well. So we need to offer scholarships, we need to offer reasons for people to actually retrain, and that means an industry that has a plan, that has a future, that we are not going to chop and change from government to government, but we're going to do it because it's what we need to do.
And there is, of course, everyone appreciates, I think, that there is a need for improved resources for training. Our government has started with the free TAFE, but we know there's a long way to go to make sure that the levels match the proposed production.
Thank you. The next question, and we're definitely into the Slido questions, so don't forget about it. Make sure you've got your questions in there or you're voting them up. I'm getting a bit of a flavour, not necessarily picking anyone specifically, but they're very helpful. Keep them coming. This one is close to my heart, and I'll let you know that the house I'm currently living in has a floor that is just chipboard on the floor, and the walls are polystyrene. Actually, literally polystyrene. So what do you plan to do to retrofit the millions of Victorian homes for efficiency, given that many of our homes are no better than living in tents, and that more people die from cold exposure in Victoria than die in Sweden from cold exposure due to the low quality of housing here? We need to address it. What will your parties do? We'll start at the other end, John.
Well, we've got a $1.3 billion solar homes program. We'll transition 775,000 households to solar power, which in turn has presumably the effect of providing more warmth, more heat. 200,000 households have already made use of this program. So the solar homes program will cut Victoria's carbon emissions by almost 4 million tonnes, the same as taking 1 million of Victoria's 4.6 million cars off the road.
I think that this is another area that we need to invest in, and we need planning, and we need to ensure that when we're building homes from the outset, that they are, 7 stars and above. 1 star is crazy. We need to be able to support people as, we need to be equitable about the way that we support people to keeping their homes insulated. We need to have better building standards. We need to invest in better building materials. We also we do have lots of subsidies also that unlock solar and things like that, but they're so complicated. There's like 14 different ways to actually get solar on your rooftop. But when I've been knocking on doors and talking to people, they don't understand how to access that. A lot of it's on the web, none of it's person to person. Older people don't know how to get solar on the roof, but they want it. We need to make sure that what we do is actually in the community, available for people to access, and they have somebody to talk to about what is best for their home, what suits their income, and how they can be subsidised to actually moving to upgrading their homes.
Yeah, look, we've got a specific plan which you heard me talk about in my opening remarks. Not only do we have a plan to support solar and batteries across 1 million homes, we're going to extend that by 100,000 to renters as well. So you get double the rebate, 8,800 for people who are renting. So particularly at that end of the market, there'll be people getting supported. So we're very conscious of that, and we've put some specifics around that to deal with the problem.
I'd like to just sympathise. I live in a house which is got mushrooms growing in the hallway. We've had sewage in the backyard. Our landlord refused to fix it for a very long time until I threatened to take him to VCAT. So what the Greens would do is quite a lot. We want to increase rental standards. We need to establish a housing ombudsman so renters' rights are protected from greedy real estate agents. But also, we've got a current 5-star efficiency rating for houses, and we want to boost that to 8 and 10 by 2030, which would look at things about how well it keeps heat in, how damp it is, how cold it gets. And like Melissa said, we need to invest in insulation, double glazing, and just improving houses across the board, because where I live is a little bit of a squalor that I'm paying way too much for.
You have all commented on transport, but there are a number of questions coming up around electric vehicles. Could you expand on what support you would offer to electric vehicles in Victoria, and more broadly across greening the whole of our transport system? Transport accounts for about 18% of our emissions in Victoria. It's a big challenge, and what would you do to take on the whole of the transport sector? And I'm going to start with you, John Pizzuto.
Yeah, look, so what you heard from me in my opening remarks about our EV policy, pausing the tax, 600 charging stations, saving electric vehicle and hybrid vehicle owners, $400 or $500 a year, depending on how far they go and how often they use their car. So we're very conscious of that. That will make a big impact. Also, I should say, on a related point to this, that you would have heard, or hopefully have heard, about an announcement we made to promote public transport with $2 fares over a 4-year period. Now, that for us had such appeal as a concept because not only does it get people on public transport, it gets them out of their cars, it deals with congestion, it deals with emissions. So it's an idea that I think has gone down rather well, to be honest, when I'm talking to people. And it's going to take a whole range of things to promote public transport use. And ideally we want more people using it. And COVID certainly sent a lot of people away from public transport. We've got to build that patronage back up, and we think that will do that as well.
One of the things that I think we should do first is actually just get rid of the tax on electric vehicles. Doesn't seem like using a stick is really encouraging. I think we also need to really encourage active transport. We need to also encourage electric bikes. We need to make our spaces greener. We need to encourage bike paths. We need to make transport less need for a car. We need to have electric charging stations. We need to make every new building that's built should have electric charging stations within that building. Where if there are cars allowed there should be electric charging stations available. We could also ensure that we do things like make green transport possible right across Victoria. We could make sure that we, that if we're touring somewhere, that we can get that way because we've got electric charging stations everywhere. I think that the electric vehicle is the way that we're going to be moving in the future, and we also need to transition away from petrol vehicles. So if government was to buy electric vehicles, if they held them for a couple of years and then sold them on cheaper, if we can transform cars that currently exist into electric vehicles, I think we need to do that as soon as possible. That uptake needs to happen. But electric bikes in an area where it's safe to ride a bike, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. John?
Yes, the people would be aware of the 3,000 rebate that we have for zero emissions. There's $100 million in funding for zero emission vehicles, and fast changing, or charges rather, over 140 have been built across Victoria. 50% of Victoria's light vehicle sales are to be zero emission vehicles by 2030. Now we know that there's also the road surcharge, which hasn't been popular with some, even though it's supported by the Australian Automobile Association and Public Transport Users Association, on the understanding that all of us have to pay for such charges in one way or such maintenance in one way or another.
Thank you. And Nick?
Well, look, like Melissa said, the EV tax needs to go. But the Greens have a big plan for transport. As part of our Zero Extinction Fund, which is $1 billion per year, which will be 1% of the state budget, we want to invest in a big bike build, so more bike lanes, more footpaths, superhighway between north and south to encourage active transport. We also want to invest in a fleet of 3,000 solar-powered buses with upgrades to bus stations so they can charge. In addition to that, there's also, my brain has just stopped. In addition to the big build with the bike lanes and active transport, we want more accessible public transport. So that's lower floored trams, more regularly, more often, because while private vehicles are nice, they are not the future. A healthy society has rich people use public transport. Yeah.
Just recently, the Victorian government introduced some anti-protest laws, and similar laws have been introduced in New South Wales and Tasmania, and seem very clearly directed at limiting environmental protests. Yet we know that environmental protests have created phenomenal change across our country, and as a result of protests, the Great Barrier Reef, the Daintree, some of our most precious forests here in Victoria have been saved, the future of the Murray River. Important ecosystems and places have been saved through the work of protest over a long period of time. Can I ask each of the candidates for their views on these protest laws and if you will work to rescind them? And I'm going to start with you, John Kennedy.
Yeah, the fundamental rationale behind the bill that we've enacted recently is the safety of forestry workers, as you've alluded to. Like all workers in Victoria, they shouldn't have to go to work in fear of mental and physical harm. As I said in Parliament on this bill, it is about striking a compromise between the protesters' right to protest and the timber workers' right to workplace safety. Protests conducted outside timber harvesting safety zones remain legal and are not affected by these changes.
I think it's a fundamental, it's a fundamental flaw against it. The law is against human rights. I mean, I think the right to be able to protest should be free for everybody. I personally think I have been involved in protests myself before, and I've also heard of young people that have been arrested and are concerned about these fines. I don't think we should be criminalising protesting, and I don't think that we should be fining people. It's a human right, it's a democratic right, and I don't think that it's the right, you should take it away from anybody. I actually was arrested once myself for trying to save trees, and because I crossed an imaginary line into a state forest, and the charges were dropped because it was about highlighting the idea that old growth forest was being wood chipped. And I do believe that people are very brave that take up the role to protest. They're often peaceful protests, and I think it's a human right.
John.
The right to protest is a fundamental human right. The issue always is, of course, though, everyone, that you've got to balance the rights with the rights of others. And that is not as easy as it might seem. So I think John was actually quite right in saying that you can still protest. The question is, do you have, for example, does the right to protest allow you to physically restrain another individual? You know, those sorts of constitutional and human rights-based questions always arise in these areas. I think as long as someone can protest and convey the message they want, I think that's really important. You do get into, and you lose me a bit on the argument when worker safety is involved, whether it's mental health or physical health, and to that extent I would be protective of that right of the worker to go about their work safely. There may well be issues you've got about the rights of an operator to persist with a logging operation or something. That's obviously a very dear thing to the protester. But there are ways that protester can still protest, convey all of the passion and meaning behind the cause they're fighting for without interfering with another individual's right.
And Nick?
Well, I think these laws are a perfect example of what the establishment really thinks. You know, they do not want people standing up against this. They want to keep through business as usual, destroying our native forests, sending us to our deaths. I don't think any of these protesters are doing this to harm workers' safety. You know, mostly they're chaining themselves to trees or just trying to survey greater gliders to make sure they're not murdered. These laws are abhorrent and, frankly, against human rights and everything we fight against.
I'm going to pull this down to the hyper-local, because everything in politics is also local. And we've got a few questions in here about tree canopy. I want to extend it beyond just Hawthorn though. What would you do to increase tree canopy and reduce urban heat island impacts in Hawthorn and across Victoria more generally? I'll start with you, John.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Well, again, I'm repeating what I said in the opening. We've invested, or we're prepared to invest 20 million to get things started in terms of metropolitan Melbourne's tree canopy, for the reasons you've explained. I should also say that we have announced a policy where we will restore the balance in planning, so that whilst we're certainly supportive of development, there is going to be more emphasis placed on protecting character and amenity and where it's justified heritage, which will have the impact of preserving that character and amenity that's so important, which would include the tree canopy in and around Burundara. So we've made some specific announcements on planning and also tree canopy to get things started.
Nick?
Yeah, so we've actually got a climate trigger plan, which would involve planting more trees on nature strips in gardens and a green roof project to reduce the urban density, urban heat issue. And also just encouraging more native plants to be in gardens, increasing the biodiversity, and again, reducing this urban heat effect.
John?
Yes, well, our government has been doing quite a lot in this area. If you went specifically here in Hawthorn, an example would be the master plan for Gardeners Creek, which is involved in cleaning the waterway, but overall, better management of the vegetation and so on that's around there.
I think we need to recognise the values of the large trees that we have and the large carbon capture that exists. And I think that we need to probably change planning laws to suit that. If we're taking down big trees, then we need to understand the value of that tree and potentially pay for the value of that tree and ensure that when we do take trees down, that we replant a significant amount of them and ensure that that's done within the year. I think that all planning, whether new planning, new buildings, should include green spaces, should be part of design, good human design. Plants and garden space, create coolness. They also, create, allow biodiversity. Plants are really important, and I think that every new space that is built should have a reflection of what that looks like for the humans involved, but also for the planet. And more green canopy, more plants, more planting, not less.
Thank you. From the hyper-local then to the very big picture, what do you think is the biggest issue facing politics in Victoria today, and what would you do about it? Melissa, starting with you.
I definitely think it's integrity, and I think that integrity, we can see that in decisions that are made around logging. We can see that in decisions that are made around environment in general, around not using evidence-based policy to make decisions. I mean, for 10 years we were stuck in the wilderness with politicians not making decisions based on evidence, based on what the community wanted. I think the two-party system has not done us any favours, and what we need to have integrity in politics, and that will help us make decisions about what we need to do in terms of the economy, in terms of climate action. Without integrity, all of this gets hidden away. These decisions get made. We don't know what the transparency is of them. We don't know what the cost of the decisions is. When we do big infrastructure projects, we need to have transparent cost-benefit analysis about where that money's going. We need integrity into why and who and how. Why are we still logging? Why are we spending 21 million on that? What is the integrity in those decisions? Who's making the decisions? Who are the other voices that are getting in the way of that decision? And we don't have transparency in that with the two-party system. With an independent, you have an independent voice who represents the community, and if the community doesn't think they're representing them, they can get rid of them. But the two-party system, they lacks transparency, they lack integrity, and this is why we are where we are.
Thank you.
I would say that there are a number of political issues or topics, particularly in education and health, but the overriding one is climate action, climate change, and the action and fairness that engenders in legislation, in finance, and general support and from the government.
Nick.
Well, like Melissa says, it's definitely integrity. Our government is basically controlled by property developers, oil and gas barons, and the gambling industry. So to deal with that, we need to ban political donations from all these sectors. We need to make sure that ministers and parliamentary officials are releasing a diary of everybody they meet with. We also need to stop the revolving door because it's killing us all.
And John.
So integrity for me takes two general forms. First of all, conduct of public officials. wherever they might be in the public sector. Obviously, we've got a problem when IBAC and the Ombudsman are preoccupied with investigation after investigation. You can see from the number of investigations that it holds that there's a definite issue there in terms of conduct, and it's incumbent upon all people coming into public office to lead by example. But there's also another aspect of integrity that I want to talk to you about, and I think it underlies so many of the problems that Victoria faces today. And I'm a governance person, so I'm big on this. I'm a believer in the independence of and importance of our institutions. And one of those institutions is the public service. And I know the public service gets a bad rap often, but the truth is it serves a very important part in our government. And it's there to provide, in an ideal setting, it's there to provide frank and fearless advice. It is functionally, not constitutionally, but it's supposed to be functionally independent from the executive arm of government, which is the political arm. That's where you get the mandate from, right? But the public service is there to serve the government of the day. And to tell you how bad things are in Victoria, we've actually got the Ombudsman in Victoria, a constitutionally independent officer of the Parliament, is actually investigating politicisation of the public service. And why is that an issue? Might not seem like an issue on a day-to-day basis, but it's a very important one. Because if our public service is not able to do that, then government's not making the best decisions it can. It doesn't have all the different views from around the table that it needs. And if you wonder whether that's important, it is important. That's why you end up with the hotel quarantine. That's why you end up with blowouts on major projects if you don't have agencies in that position to provide that frank and fair. So for me, it's a conduct but also process of government as well.
For tonight, I'm going to pose a question to each of you individually, which will be the conclusion. I'm going to start with you, John. You mentioned when we were here 4 years ago, you weren't entirely expecting to be back on the stage 4 years later. You were the 100 to 1. You did the Stephen Bradbury and made quite an impression. And the last 4 years have seen actually quite a phenomenal amount of action on climate change. As a climate campaigner who's been working on state issues for 15 years, it's been quite a turnaround. But at the same time, your party is still logging old growth forests and native forests, and you are still supporting the expansion of offshore gas. So why, when we're in an emergency and we need to see action go even further in the future, why should this audience give you their vote at the upcoming election for action on climate change?
Because of what I said at the start in those 5 minutes, I indicated a number of developments and achievements of the government, basically, and I think to encourage people to vote for the government, to keep Hawthorn in the government, is important and is a good option.
Thank you. Melissa, this area has just elected an independent MP, but it did so with a government in place that was, still in some people's view, denying that there was action on climate change, where there was a palpable desire for change in the community, and where an independent was seen as providing a real step forward and a real shift. That's not the case in this state election. There is a government that has been acting on climate change, and there has been movement and progress, and we now see commitments on climate change across the board. Why would you think this audience should be voting for you as an independent for action on climate change at this election? And a two-part special as our independent. If you were elected and if there was a hung parliament, which party would you be supporting to take government?
As if you'll answer that.
I will answer that, John. and I will say that I will be, I think there have been some good points actually, in terms of which party I would support. I wouldn't support a party. I would support the evidence and what the community wants and the evidence that's provided at the time. And that's the way I would vote, is based on evidence and what the community wants, not what the party wants. Why should you vote for me? Because I don't want to continue forest logging. I do think that it's 24% of carbon capture. It's incredibly important to biodiversity. Locally, it's important to our water. It's important to clean water. If we keep logging, we will not have these forests. They will be gone. And 2030, there isn't even a legislated end to forest logging. That's one reason. The whole reason about integrity in politics, the whole reason that John mentioned about the politicising of government staff, about the, that is meant, they are meant to be independent. I might also add that the Liberal Party federally sacked most of the cabinet staffers and brought in pollsters to do their work, so there's a little bit of integrity lack there as well. So an independent for Hawthorn would stand up for what the people of Hawthorn want, and people do want action on climate change. People do want integrity in politics. People do want major change in health. And as has been noted before, Jono, you actually said this, that a lot of the work that has to happen with relation to climate change actually it happens at a state level. And this is where the big infrastructure needs to happen. This is where the big work needs to be done. And this is where a community needs to be able to trust its politicians and trust that we will do what you want us to do and not be beholden to party policy.
Thank you. John Pasuto, as you said, you were also on this stage 4 years ago. And at the time, the Victorian Liberal Party did not have a position on climate change anywhere near what we're seeing today. You had not committed to targets to cut emissions. We still saw denialism in parts of the party. We still see that denialism in parts of the party federally. This is obviously a big turnaround, but there's scepticism as to whether this is real in the party. Why should the voters here today vote for you for action on climate change?
Because you've seen the progress over the last 4 years, what we've committed to today. You heard my remarks about being totally committed to what we need to do. And I sincerely believe that it's an exciting journey that we're on, but the hardest stuff is before us. And the question I ask all of you to consider tonight and beyond tonight, leading into the election, when you cast your ballot, is who of the four of us do you want there, in there, helping shepherd not just the Hawthorn community, the entire Victorian community and Victoria's place in the nation as we move on that journey. Because remember, we're all part of a national electricity market, and that infrastructure work has not yet been done. Some of it's been done, but it's not yet done. There's a long way to go. And I think we're going to be better off, ladies and gentlemen, if we have leaders in the Victorian Parliament who can help do that. I come in good faith on this issue. Me and a whole bunch of other people in the party have worked hard to shift our party in that position and in that direction, and we'll go further. But you've seen tonight our progress so far. So I'm someone who will do that passionately, enthusiastically, understanding that intergenerational equity means a lot to all of us. I know. We want to know that when we leave this mortal coil, that we've left the world in a better place. And I want that against my name, and I know you want it against your name too.
And Nick, final question for you. It's no surprise that the Greens have a good climate and environmental policy. This kind of a forum's a bit of a gimme for you, right? Like this is your safe space. But we are beyond just banner waving and policies that some people might think are unrealistic in some time frames. We do need action, we need tangible action, and it needs to be delivered, and we need people who can make sure it is delivered. Why should the crowd here today be voting for you to be their representative?
Well, like you said, the Greens' environmental policy is pretty much a given, but you can guarantee that the Greens don't take any donations from property developers, the gambling industry, or the big banks. We are entirely people funded. Everything we do is consulted, we decide upon by talking to community members and members of our own party. And if I was elected, so you can guarantee we'll actually follow through with our promises. Speaking personally, a lot of the issues that I'm campaigning on are things that me and my friends all suffer from, being out of control rent, poor living standards, education, all of these things. And I am sick and tired of having to suffer just to live. So if I'm elected, I'll definitely fight for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, here you have it, your candidates for election. Would you please give them a huge round of applause? It's always a pleasure to do these forums in Hawthorn. You're always a very polite audience, so thank you. But it doesn't mean it is any easier for candidates to get up here, to front these questions, and to be grilled by each other and by all of you. So very, very much expressing the appreciation of the whole crowd to all of you for being here today. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, your participation, and of course, your manners. I was at a forum, this is not my first one for the election season, and I was at one in Colac last week that was a little different. Thank you, Mick, sorry, and we'll hand over to you to wrap us up for the evening.
Hi, my name's Mick Nolan. I'm co-convener at Light of Footprints along with Lynn Franks. It's been so good to have this opportunity to showcase our democracy and the climate convictions of our candidates. The election pre-poll starts in 1.5 weeks. We hope you will use tonight's forum to inform your vote and elevate climate as the critical issue. There are just 2 state elections between now and 2030. This election, starting in a few weeks' time, and the pre-poll starting in 1.5 weeks, and then in 2026. In terms of our elected MPs, we think 2022 to 2026 is the critical 4 years on climate in Victoria. I'm now going to thank a few people for tonight and outline some next steps for Light of Footprints. If I could ask Jono to come up, please. Jono Leno's CEO of Environment Victoria. Environment Victoria has been raising public awareness and persuading Victorian governments to act for more than 50 years. Thank you for tonight, Jono, and for all EV continues to do. And Victoria Mackenzie McHarg, Strategic Director, Women's Environmental Leadership Australia, creating stronger leadership across women's networks. Victoria is a long-time friend of Light of Footprints, as you've heard. She is polite, but so incisive in getting the most out of forums like these. Thank you, Victoria.
Authorised by Light of Footprints Incorporated, Q, Victoria.